The first loop that we're going to go through is the while loop. Now, the while loop loops through an array or a collection, and then it checks for a conditional each time. If it meets a condition, then it goes on to and iterates through it again. If the condition is not met, so say it reaches the end of a iteration or it meets the end of a collection, something like that, then it ends and it moves on to the rest of the program. While loops, even though they may be very popular in other languages such as PHP, JavaScript, and some languages like that, they're not very popular in Ruby, and in fact, I'm not even sure the last time I actually used one besides just teaching it in theory. I put it into this course because I wanted you to be able to see it so you could kind of get your mind around connecting how looping works, but in the next few episodes after this, we'll also discuss what the more standard loops are in Ruby. The syntax for a while loop is first to have some type of collection, because you do need to iterate over something, and then you need to set a iteration variable. This is going to be what we're looking for each time and what the while loop conditional is going to look for before it prints anything out. So the while loop is going to look at I, and it says while I is less than or equal to, and I set it in this case to the array count minus 1. And the reason I have to do this is because if you remember, arrays do have a 0 index, so I need to do minus 1 in order to get what the actual count is. So until it reaches that point, then do this. And inside of the while loop, you pass a block, and so anything that you want to happen, you just put inside of the loop. So in this case, we're just printing out the array. I'm grabbing the value of I, and so we're going to be just printing out that value. And after that, one thing to make sure that you never hit an infinite loop is you need to increment I plus 1 with each count, or else you would just have an infinite loop and it would just print out the first element of the array over and over and over again until the system crashed. At the end of it, you just hit end, and that is it for the while loop. So in the demo, I'm going to walk through how to create this, and then we'll move on to some of the more standard loops that you use in Ruby. In this demo, we're going to walk through how to create and use a while loop. So the first thing I'm going to do is create an array. So I'm going to say r equals, and then I'm going to use an automatic array creator. So I'm going to say 1.10 2 underscore array. And all that's going to do is it's passing a range, and it's a shortcut to create an array. It's a syntax I like to use a lot. And so now that we have our array, we want to create a iteration variable and set it equal to 0. And this is what our while loop's going to be looking at. So I'm going to say while I is less than or equal to the array count minus 1. And remember, we have to do that because of the arrays have a 0 index. So if we didn't do that, we'd end up getting a nil value at the end. And so I want to say do, and we're simply going to be printing this out and then incrementing. Now, when I create a while loop, one thing I always do is I create the incrementer first, because I have the tendency to forget it, and then I create an infinite loop and I have to restart the program. So I plus equals 1 means that with every iteration, it's going to find whatever this value is and add 1 to it. If you're new to programming, this would be the same as saying I equals I plus 1, but most languages have this increment syntax. So I'm going to say plus 1, and now we're just going to print the value out. So I'm going to say print the value of the array at this iteration. So all this is doing is it's going to start at 0. So the first time it comes through, it's going to say while I is less than or equal to the end of the array, which the first time it definitely will be. And then we want to say, I want to print out the array element at the 0 index, because this is what it's starting out as. The next time through, it's going to, or the very next thing it's going to do, is change that index value and add 1 to it. So the next time this comes through, this is going to be the same as saying I1. And then the time after that, 2, 3, 4, all the way until it's done. So by using I there, we're able to make it more dynamic. So I'm going to switch over to the terminal, type in Ruby while example, hit return, and that all worked. So it prints out each one of the items from 1 to 10. So this is the syntax for creating a while loop in Ruby. In this lesson, we're going to cover the each loop. The each loop iterates through an array or a hash, or really any type of collection, and it runs through the entire collection until it either completes or it breaks out early. It's one of the most popular looping mechanisms in Ruby, and I'm going to show you why. It's very flexible, and it's much less error-prone than some of the other looping mechanisms, such as while loops. It utilizes a block structure, and it also can provide an index value. So we're going to go through each one of those, and then afterwards we'll do a demo on showing all of that. So a basic example is we have an array, and with a each loop, all we have to do is type in array.each, do, and then we can use the I in the pipe syntax. And we do that because that's what's going to give us access to each one of those elements. And in this case, I just want to print each one of them out, and that is all we have to do. Notice if you compare this with a while loop or other types of looping structures, you have to usually put some kind of value there that it's checked on a conditional in order to not have things like like running out of memory and different things like that, because you went infinitely higher, like you never actually ran into the conditional. With each loops, you don't have to do that. Each loops do not have a conditional. Their only condition is that they are going through each one of the items. So that way, it's not, you don't have to worry about, like say with the while loop, while I is less than or equal to the count of the array or anything like that. What each does is it looks at the total count and it runs through all of them. There are ways of breaking out of it early if you want to, but for this case, all we want to do is iterate through each one of them and grab the value. So this is a really nice way of doing it. It also has another syntax that makes it even more efficient to write. It's not always what you would want to do because it can be a little bit harder to read, but it is important to know it's there. Because it's a block, the way that Ruby works with blocks is instead of having do and end and having the whole code snippet on multiple lines, if you put curly brackets around where the do and end would go, you can put it all on one line. So if you need to iterate over something very, very simple like this very small array and you're just wanting to print the values out, you can do it on one line and it makes it more efficient. Now, it's also possible to use and grab an index, and it's because there's a method very similar to each called each with index, and it takes two different parameters. One, it takes a value, and then the second one it takes is the index for what it's iterating through. So even though it's an array, it can actually iterate through and tell you, okay, the index of the first item was this, the index of the second item was this. And so it makes it really nice if you're iterating through a collection and you want to know what order in the collection one of those items is. And this is how you can do it. It's each underscore with underscore index. You start a block. You pass in two different iterator variables instead of one. Or if you remember with the other ones, we just passed a single one, and that's all we needed. The index value, index as a word doesn't mean anything. We could call that I, we could call it whatever we wanted. What's important to know is when you put the pipes up with each with index, the second argument is the one that is going to store the index. So now that you have a good idea on how to create each loops and how to work with eaches with indexes, now let's go through the demo. In this demo, we're going to walk through how the each method works. As you can see right up here, I created an array, and I use the syntax of creating a range and then converting it to an array. So all I have to do is type array.each, then start a block. So I'm going to say do, and then I'm going to pass in an iterator variable. And for this case, I'm just going to keep using I, and then hit end at the very end of it. So what this is doing for us is it's creating a block very similar to the way we did with the while. But one thing that you may want to notice that's different between the each and the while loop is here we don't have to create any type of sentinel value. So if you remember in the beginning with while loops we created I and set that equal to 0, and then inside of the loop we had to have that I increment by 1 to make sure that we didn't hit an infinite loop. With each loops, we don't have to worry about that because if we say that this is the array, this is the array that this one up top is already going to be created. We're just using the shortcut syntax to do it. What each is doing is it's going and it's looking at the first element, then the second one, then the third, then the fourth, all the way down. Whereas the while loop is looking at each one of those items, but not really based off of the count. All it's looking at is to say, is I less than or equal to the array count minus 1. Notice how much uglier that is and how much harder it is to read, and it's also much buggier. There's tons of times where I've gotten lazy and I've done a while loop and did I equals less than or equal to the array count. The problem is because arrays are based with 0 indexes, I is going to start at 0, so that's always going to be off by 1. Whereas with each loops, it actually looks at the collection size itself. It doesn't care about conditionals or anything like that, and it just goes through each item. So I'm going to just print this out, and I'm going to come up here. I'll hit clear so we can start fresh. Say Ruby each example, and it prints that out perfectly. It goes 1 through 10. So that works very nicely. Now, one thing to know with Ruby, whenever you're using blocks, so whenever you have a do and an end block, those also can be substituted with curly braces. So if I get rid of all of this, I can do curly braces, pass in our iterator variable in pipes the same way as before, and then just press PI, and this is going to do the exact same thing for us. So save the file, come back here, and it works just like before. Now, you don't see this syntax a lot because usually when you're running each loops, you're trying to do some things that are a little bit longer, like running database queries or printing out all the values from a database query, something like that. But here, we're really only caring about printing out the values from the array, so it's fine to do it this way. Now, I'm going to replace these and come back down. And I'm also going to get rid of this because the next method I want to cover is each with index. So with each with index, it's going to do the same thing as each, except it's going to pass a second argument over here. So I'm going to make these more explicit and say the first argument in the iterator variable is going to be value. The second one is index. This is not a magical term. I could call it I could call it A, I could call it anything I wanted. But usually when you're building Ruby programs, if you remember duck typing, you want whatever your code is doing to be very explicit. So if I want to print out an index, I want to use index as the name. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to iterate through this, and I'm going to print out the index and the value for each one. So I'm going to say print, and inside this I'm going to do some string interpolation, and I'm going to say value and say the value is set to the value, and then for the index I'm going to say that that is set to the index. And let's see if this works. Coming over here, printing out, and there you go. That worked perfectly. The value of the first one's 1. The index is 0, all the way down to the value being 10 and the index 9. So note that it's grabbing the index from the array, and that's what's getting printed out. So it's very different than the value. It's one off, and that's perfect. That shows you how easy it is to be able to work with the index. This is something that's really helpful if you ever want to have, like, say that you have a set of strings. So say this set up a string array, and here I'm going to have the Houston Astros. So I have the Houston Astros each set up as their own element. Now, if I use the string array, this is going to be a little bit more practical, and come down here and print it out, you can see that the value of the is at index 0. The value of Houston is at index 1. So it's really helpful when you're doing things like working with arrays of strings or things like that, where you want to know at what level and where is this index value, or where's this value sorted. And since you can grab the index value, it makes it really nice and efficient for being able to do that. The third loop that we're going to work on is the generic loop. Now, years ago, a lot of Rubyists used to use the while loop, and that was considered normal. And there are plenty of times where the each loop is great, such as working with collections and iterating over them. However, what happens if you're not looping over a collection, but instead you're looping over a process or workflow? Each loop isn't really handy with that because it only works with collections. So that's why they created the loop, and it is literally called loop. So don't get it confused when we say looping with some of the other methods. The method name actually is loop, and then everything inside of it, inside of the block that we pass to it, is what gets looped over. Now, it's very similar if you've ever seen while true, meaning that while true would usually have an infinite loop, but it is really something that just requires a break statement. So you have to be able to say, I want you to loop until this happens, which sounds similar to a while loop, except it has some few key differences that are preferred by most Rubyists. It's very similar to a do-while loop. Technically, Ruby does not have a do-while loop, but looping by using a generic loop makes it possible. And I thought we'd do something fun for the code demo, and this is going to be a preview of it, where we're going to create a guessing game. So I'm setting the correct answer equal to 42. The syntax is just loop do, and then everything inside of that loop do is going to be in a block. So I'm going to ask the user to guess the number. I'm going to get the number, and then I'm going to break out if they guess the correct answer. So if the number is equal to the correct answer, we'll say that that's correct, and if not, we'll say, sorry, try again. Notice how we're not using any if statements or anything like that. The nice thing about the way that loops are structured is it all is sequential anyway, and if you have the break, then everything after the break gets skipped if that break condition is met. So now let's go through this in the demo. In this demo, we're going to use the loop mechanism in order to create a small guessing game. So I'm going to set the correct answer and put that in a variable. And I'm going to set it equal to 10. And you may wonder why I'm doing it in a string. And the reason for that is when we're typing in the console, it's actually, Ruby's interpreting that as a string. So this is just kind of a shortcut so we don't have to convert the value typed in to an integer. So the correct answer is 10. And now the loop syntax is just to give the word loop followed by do, and it doesn't take any arguments or iteration variables or anything like that, because this is essentially setting it up for an infinite loop that needs to have a break statement. So the first thing I'm going to do is say puts, which is another way of print. They're pretty similar. We'll go over the details later on in the course. But I'm going to say puts and say guess the number. and then we need to set up a way of getting information from the console, and the way to do that is to use the gets method. So I'm going to put it inside of a variable. So I'm going to say num equals gets.chomp, and then I'm going to say, and in case you're not familiar with chomp, chomp just removes any backspace character. So if we didn't do this, and they typed in, say they typed in 20, it would actually be interpreted. First, it is a string, so it would be interpreted like this, and then it would be given a backline character, which we don't want because that would throw off our match. So gets chomp dot chomp is just a way of cleaning it up, so it removes the backline character. Okay, so next thing we're going to do is set a break statement. So we're going to say break if the num, which is what the user guessed, is equal to the correct answer. So the double equals means is this equal? And we're saying here, I want you to break from the loop if the number, which is the number the user guessed, is equal to the correct answer variable. If not, just put sorry, guess again, and it'll start the whole loop over again. So let's start this in the console. I'm going to say Ruby loop example. It says guess the number. I'm going to say 44. Sorry, guess again. Guess the number. Say 11. Same thing. 10, and it ends. And that's all we had to do. If this was a real game, we'd have something down here saying, puts great job, and we'd also probably have a way of breaking out if they wanted to quit early on in the game, but we don't have to worry about that. This is more just walking through how to use the looping mechanism. So the keys to remember when using a loop is a very straightforward syntax. It doesn't really have a conditional the same way that they have with a while loop. Instead, it has to have a break statement located somewhere inside of the loop block. If you didn't have this, so if we commented this out, then we would have an infinite loop because there was no chance of ever breaking out of it. So the key to remember, if there's a loop, you need to have a break or some way of getting out of it so that it doesn't become an infinite loop.